my paper is Corruption and Environmental Sustainability. When I got the conference theme and the green and the environment and about the environment, I thought, you know, I've never seen anything about, is corruption in a government related to how a country is handling their environment and environmental sustainability? So one of the things that I looked at were the Millennium Development Goals of the United Nations, which were developed, the 8 goals were developed in year 2000. And goal number 7 is the one that is related to the environment and environmental sustainability. And there were 4 targets associated with that particular goal. The first one was an evaluation of the country's policies and programs towards sustainability. What were they doing to sustain the environment? The second target was to reduce the biodiversity loss. This is one of the things that is very prominent in so many countries. And the third one was to have, by 2015, this year, the proportion of the population without access to safe drinking water and basic sanitation. And the fourth target was to significantly improve the lives of at least 100 million slum dwellers around the world. Now, looking at those sort of goals, I was trying to figure out, you know, how could I relate that to the corruption levels within the country? And one of the things we found that there's definitely been progress in some of these areas. There have been major improvements, about a 40% improvement in access to basic sanitation and safe drinking water since 1990. That's a pretty significant improvement. And the lives of many slum dwellers have been improved. There were 44 million, they said, which are no longer living in slums around the world. But in absolute numbers, this is the one that astounds me, is there are about 1 million more slum dwellers in the world because of population increase than there was when they started. Even though they've gotten 44 million out, there are all these other people that have gotten in the slums. And forests are continuing to disappear at a very, very fast pace. This is one of the things that we do know. And marine stock is not able to produce sustainable yields. We haven't been doing a very good job in these particular areas. Now, there are very definitely inconsistencies among the countries. 2 examples have to do with the policies and institutions for environmental sustainability and the proportion of the population with access to safe drinking water. In other words, some countries are really improving and some are regressing. Some are getting worse. And the question is why? Why are some improving? Why isn't everyone improving? What is the cause of some of them regressing on these really basic goals? And I said, well, could it possibly be because of government corruption? Could that be one of the things that's influencing us? Now, looking at corruption, the United Nations definition, which they came up with in 2003, was the abuse of public office for private gain. Now, we all know there's all sorts of other corruption. There's private corruption, FIFA, as we know, and all sorts of corruption. But we're looking at government corruption in this particular thing, because I think this really has the greatest impact as far as environmental sustainability. And one of the things that if you look at the literature, you find there's various quotes, just a couple I have here, there's more in the paper. Corruption adversely affects economic growth was sort of received as wisdom. And one of the things that we have is that corruption can lead to economic expansion or economic restrictions. Last year in Montreal, I presented a paper and we were talking about the pros and cons. And it's looking at that maybe in the short term, it can really cause expansion, but in the long term, it can be very detrimental. So sometimes you get a little bit of graph, which will do things very positive, but that's only in the short run. If it continues on, then it becomes very negative. And overall, the literature weighs heavily towards the negative of corruption. And it really says that corruption is related to economic development. But the real question is, and this was alluded to in a couple of the papers yesterday, is are economic development and environmental sustainability compatible? Are these compatible concepts? Or many times are we trying to do economic development at the cost of environmental sustainability? And there's a question, is how do you balance these two? This is not the focus of this paper, but I think it's a really interesting question. It's the idea how these two correspond. Now in this paper, the methodology I used, the first thing was to use operational definitions. And for corruption in this particular paper, I used Transparency's International Corruption Perception Index, which is probably the best source, probably the most cited source for corruption. 177 countries they have. They've been doing this for quite some time. They use a variety of different measures, surveys, and all sorts of different ways that they measure corruption. And one of the things that I used both 2010 and 2013 data for this particular research. But one of the things I'd like to point out is in 2010, the CPI was on a 10-point scale, with a 10 being the least corrupt countries and a 1 being the most corrupt. They changed it to a 100-point scale. So therefore, in 2013, it's on a 100-point scale, with 100 being absolute. No country gets 100, I'll tell you that right now. And as a matter of fact, the majority of the countries score below 50. This is one of the things that you find, that all countries have some level of corruption. There is no country that is really very, very clean. The number of countries I used is because I had to find countries that I could find data on environmental sustainability and corruption. So therefore, this is why the number gets smaller. On environmental sustainability, I used the World Bank's information. And they have data on a country's environmental programs and policies, which is a scale of 1 to 6, with a 6 being very high or very good, that they have excellent programs, and a 1 being the very poor. I also used the World Bank's data on the percent of the population to access to safe drinking water. And World Bank data on this particular item was available for 200 countries. Now, I would like to put one sort of thing here. It goes along with the accounting that we heard yesterday morning. How good this data, reported data is, I don't know. I mean, it's the best available that there is. Are these accurate figures? I don't really know. So we're going to trust them, because I think in many cases there's corruption in the way one reports. And so this is, I'd like to just point this out. I'm not exactly sure. Now, one of the things that you find, I looked at the policy ratings, and as I said, this is on a 1 to 6 scale. No country received higher than a 4, and no country received a 1. All countries rated by the World Bank receive between a 1 and a 4. And this is done in half or 0.5 increments. So this is the way that they do it. And if you look at this particular one, I used both 2010 and 2013 Corruption Perception Index. And one of the things I used the earlier ones because of the idea, I figure that if the government was corrupt before, they probably were not going to get good policies in. So I looked at both of them to see how it was going to work. And one of the things that you find in this, it pretty much looks like one would expect it to look. Let's see, is this, yes, this is it. For example, is that the policy ratings, as you see, they go in the order that one would assume. Is the less corruption in a country, the better the programs and policies. And this was one of the things that you look at. It's in the order that one would expect. And if you see overall, when I ran the statistics, you find this is significant at the 0.000 level, and there is definitely a relationship. Is the less corrupt the countries, the better the programs and policies on sustainability. So that worked really nicely. But I went ahead and I looked at the idea of whether or not between the 2010 and 2013, whether they'd improved or regressed as far as their program policies went. There were 16 countries which were rated as having improved policies in this 3-year period, and there were 11 countries which were evaluated as regressing on policies. And if you notice, there's, most of them are by a half point. But if you notice, there's there's 2 countries which went down a full point, which is pretty significant when you look at those countries. And when you look at it, that these countries improved on it. And so I looked at the idea that the ratings and the Consumer Perception Index, and one of the things that it came out when I ran the difference between needs, there's no difference. There was no significant difference in the corruption of these countries and whether they improved or whether they regressed as far as policies. And I thought, this is really sort of strange, but this is one of the things that came out of the data. So one of the things is programs and policies ratings increase, there is a corresponding increase in the Consumer Perception Index. The cleaner the country, the higher the rating for environmental programs. But there was no statistically significant difference between the countries that improved and the countries that regressed. And this was a very interesting finding as far as I was concerned. When I looked at safe drinking water, this was very interesting. 27 countries reported 100% of the population had access to safe drinking water. Now, my own country, the United States, we were only at 96%. So we are one of those countries. Most of them were European countries, Scandinavian countries that had the 27 countries. 79 countries reported an increase in the percent of the population with access to safe drinking water. But 5 countries reported a decrease in the percent of the population with safe drinking water. This really surprised me. I thought, why would you get a lower percent of the population during this period of time? And when I ran the statistics, I found there was a statistically significant CPI difference between the countries that increased and the percent of the population with access and countries that experienced a decrease. But the results were not in the direction that one would expect. In other words, the more corrupt countries improved, the less corrupt countries went down. This is exactly the opposite as one would say. And I scratched my head, I went back, I talked to some of my colleagues, I thought, how could this be? Why would more corrupt countries get improvement and less corrupt? Well, I didn't have time. Unfortunately, I was trying to meet my deadline to go through all of them. But one of the things that I did is I took the 2 extremes. 2 extremes are the country with the greatest improvement in the percent of the population with access to safe drinking water, which was Guinea-Bissau, and they had an increase of almost 5% of the population with increase to safe drinking water. But they had a corruption perception index of 19, which makes it one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Okay, Lesotho. They had the largest decline in the percent of the population with access to safe drinking water, which was almost 3%. And they had a corruption index of 49, which was substantially higher than Guinea-Bissau. I said, why on the earth is this? If you look at these 2 countries, both African countries, and here you have up there, and you have down here, where I'm missing it. It's right by South Africa. They're little tiny. There it is. But they are about the same size. The two countries, Guinea-Bissau is one of the more corrupt countries of the world. As I said, it was ranked 163 out of 175 countries. There weren't that many countries, only 12 countries were rated lower than it. Water is about 22% of the geographical area. It is very politically unstable, and there's a lot of drug transshipments. There is from South America transshipment to Europe. This is one of the things, there's a lot of drug cartels going along, and it's very much. But I looked at what would happen to the water there. And what I found, it's received help from the World Bank and charitable organizations. Many charitable organizations, religious organizations, and other groups have gone in, dug wells, improved it, given it. There's also an emergency electric and water rehabilitation project, which the World Bank is helping to fund, so it's external. It's not what the country's doing internal, it's people coming from outside are coming in to improve the drinking water. Okay. Unfortunately, Lesotho doesn't have outside people coming in. It's less corrupt. But one of the things why it went down is it is a shortage of cash. It needs hard currency. So what it did was selling its water to South Africa for industrial use at the expense of safe drinking water for its own population. I thought this was very sad, but this is really what happened, because they need hard currency. Water is one of its natural resources, one of its few natural resources, and so they started selling it. They transferred it to create revenue for the country, for other things. Now they do have a project which is designed by 2020 to make water more accessible to the local population, but that we're talking about 5 years away. That's a long time away. There also, the question is, do they really lack, or they have the knowledge or technology to create better water access? But in the meantime, they are selling water to South Africa to get better access. So one of the things that I pretty much concluded from this, the results are really mixed. One of the things we do find on environmental programs and policies, the less corrupt, the better the policies. But less corruption does not appear to improve access to safe drinking water because outside organizations appear to come in to help. In other words, I guess the secret is if you want outside organizations to come in and help you, you become very corrupt. It's sort of the idea that outside organizations want to really help these countries. So this was sort of where I ended up with, and what I really plan to do, and I just haven't gotten around to it yet, is to look at the other countries and try to figure out, particularly the other 5 countries that had less access to safe drinking water, what really happened in those 5 countries. Was it something like this? And what about the corrupt countries? If looking at the other 15 countries, was it possible that outside organizations also help those? So this was pretty much my presentation. Thank you.
Interesting, because you have given us a kind of an idea of what exactly happening in terms of MDGs. What, number 7 is it? Yeah, goal. About 2 things. About the environmental and economic development or growth sort of, relation. I think there is one excellent sort of paper on this based on the Kuznets curves, Kuznets curve, and this is called EKC, Environmental Kuznets curve, which means Kuznets curve was inversed, reversed. The second thing is about how exactly the pollution and growth was behaving in the Southeast Asian or East Asian nations. You have put the African countries, but East or Southeast Asian countries also were pretty poor in the 50s and something like South Korea was pretty poor. I mean, if you know that South Korean per capita GDP in 1961 was less than Pakistan and India, and less than Sri Lanka. And now South Korea is one of the OECD nations. Yes. Same as Japan, but Japan is having a different story, I suppose, than South Korea. But what happened in those two countries, when they developed over a period of time, they definitely polluted the country. It's a huge rate of pollution. But once they hit a higher income status, the people, they themselves realized that, oh, what we are going to face in 20 years' time, what our children is going to do, or grandchildren. So they started sort of, changing the policies and asking politicians, you have to, so you can see now Japan is doing really very good job, South Korea. And most interestingly, I mean, there is a huge debate about China and India, as you will see. And China is one of the highest emitters. And even China is having a policy, or policies rather, they were pretty exciting at this moment of global sort of environmental problem. So I think in terms of pollution is going to go up first. And EKC tells us that it's going to go down once you are developed.
Well, and as I said, that's economic development and the environment, which I really didn't go into in this paper. I wasn't looking at that.
Yeah, I mean, this is...
Yes, I think that's a very interesting, maybe next year.
But about the water thing also, I mean, yes, South Africa was a very sort of poor show. But if you look at Indian subcontinent, you see, I mean, all those 4 or 5 countries in the South Asian region, they improved quite a bit. Very interesting results. If you go to those World Bank sort of,
I did. I went to all of it. I went through every single piece of data that they had. But I only really worked with those that I had CPI numbers for.
Yeah.
I mean, because I had to have both.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting thing.
Okay, that was my comment.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I wanted to say, like, probably the corruption in the countries which had the corruption increased, but the facilities improved. As you said, probably because of external efforts. But that itself might have contributed to the increase of corruption, because obviously the government would take these external efforts and funding and count it in their budget as efforts done for the people. So while the population or people think that this came from the government, or they said they brought this money in, and then that added to the corruption, which is very sad. But maybe the way forward is to encourage the external bodies not to put money, but to put pressure on the government to provide facilities and services for the people. So to reduce corruption rather than bringing external funding. Then my question is how, like, I mean, is this corruption and disease, how they worked out? I mean, who does work them out? I mean,
Transparency International has it, if you go to their website, they probably are the best. I'm not saying they're perfect, and please don't get me wrong. They use a variety of different measures. They use several different measures, and then they consolidate them to get an index of corruption. But it is recognized really as probably the best data on corruption that we have right now.
Okay, and then lastly, you said that countries reported that the number of people who have access to good water, is that the countries reported?
Well, it's a combination of the World Bank sort of looks at it, but the countries also have to do their own reporting. Okay?
Sorry.
The other very simple question, so we're also about your use of percentages, but I'd like to see the actual figures, because was Guinea-Bissau going from 50 to 55, while Lesotho was going from 90 to 88. So I'd be quite interested to see your actual, the absolute levels as well as the changes, because we're talking about changes over a couple of years, and there may be some statistical issues to do with that. Second, so I'd be interested to see, where the level is, as well as, just a change. The other thing was, of course, with more corrupt regime may corrupt the figures as well, as you did make that point. So in a way, do you believe that plus 4.8 as much as the 2.4? But I think you answered that by saying some of them are external sources.
Yes, one is always limited to the data that's available when you're doing it. And I do have those figures that they aren't in the paper at the level at which they were. And I'm trying to remember what I don't think it's in table 3. I've got a table 3 there, but I don't remember if I have it in table 3 because I didn't have table 3. Is it in there? I didn't remember if it was in.
Page 75 starts.
Yeah, it's just the way to interpret,
yes,
the changes, particularly if you're taking just a few years, then how you interpret that. The other thing, the 5, I presumed some of them might be places like Syria or something like that, or are they totally, I don't know if that was, where you got a war would partly explain a sharp decrease, but I don't know if that was.
But didn't I have the ones that? Oh, I didn't put that table in there, I'm sorry. Yes, I didn't put it in there. If I remember correctly, most of them were in Africa, but yes.
Okay, thank you. Very nice paper. And I think I can see this is the third time I think you're developing this. And I think it's very interesting. Some comments, maybe suggestions. One point about Ron, which I think about the percentage and to see the actual. There is a Russian Harvard economist called Grenchenko. I don't know if he's well known, cited. He said each country had its own backwardness. So when they progress, you have to take the history of the backwardness into account, because just to go back to what he's saying, if you look into the World Bank Knowledge Economy Report 2013 or 14, both of them, I can ask you, I test you all, what is the country in the whole world the World Bank considered as had made the most progress in reforming and improving its education index? Maybe I can test you all, or think. I hope so. In the last 11-12, because the World Bank report, when they looked at the knowledge economy, one of the pillars they will assess called education index, which number of schools, how many girls go to school, and so on and so on. Yes. Interestingly, Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia.
Yes. Saudi Arabia jumped 25 steps. But what's important, I think, to take from here is that when you look into country specific, maybe for your work, but I'm really interested in your work, to see a small change in the policy, the one who died, King Abdullah, did in innovating approach to education in school, have made a remarkable change in moving the country. It was very backward in education, moved 25 steps. And I remember I had one of my students in Sussex, and I asked her, she said to me, yes, he had given his full political support and money to reform education in Saudi Arabia. So I think that's something you take into account based on this Grenchenko, the Russian Harvard theory of each country had its own backwardness. So that is documented, interestingly. Now, the second thing I want to say, maybe for future, you might look into if there is any regional impact on how countries are doing. Mm-hmm. Because from my work on knowledge management and sustainability, these countries are always doing excellent, the Scandinavian. If you look into sustainability index, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, they're always doing best.
Yes.
If you look into the knowledge economy, they're always leading. The leading country in the whole world in the knowledge economy is Sweden. Sustainability, Finland was one of the leading ones. So maybe there's a regional impact, so that's how your neighbors, particularly if you have very good close relationship with your neighbors, it might have an impact on how you conduct you govern yourself. There is another also similarity in region, which is this Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Oman. All of them have made remarkable progress in terms of knowledge economy. UAE was the world bottom in the table in 2001 and 2007 in sustainability, the bottom in the whole world. Now they are number 32. And if you look to Oman also, maybe you can also consider looking into regional impact on countries, how they behave. And maybe you will go to some of these corrupted countries in Africa, you see the whole region is corrupted. So that means when I see my neighbor is corrupted, my neighbor is corrupted, I don't care. And they're all saying, my dad and all people, I mean, I don't know if you have heard it, if you go to your dad and say, okay, I failed, he said, you failed? You will say to him, yes, the whole class failed. Then he says, okay. And I remember hearing this from one of the ministers, I can't remember, Qatari minister. They said to him about whatever relationship, and he said, we all Arab are very bad on this, so I don't care. So I think that might be something to consider, because this is a very interesting to see how this
I think this is sort of the beginning of it. It was the first time I had looked at it, so it was just sort of, how can I put something together for the conference?
Yeah, I'm sorry. So may I have a similar suggestion with Alam? Maybe you should put some internal, you should also put some internal dynamics, domestic dynamics into this model, I mean into this analysis, maybe dummy or something like this.
Yes.
Because you mentioned that Lesotho gives or sent water to South Africa. So if it doesn't send it, so it might be changed, the result. Because of this, I remember this dynamics.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I was just going to add, when we have 5% increase, it depends where we start.
Yes.
If you have,
yes.
That's, I think, the point. So that's, yes.
Yes. If I remember, it was in the 60 or 70%, somewhere along in there. And I do have the data, but I don't have it in this paper, sorry.
Can I just make another point, please? Not about Beverlee's one, what Alam was trying to say about education, right? Yeah, that was a good point. The point, what you have got in percentage term is excellent. But this is from a very low base.
Yes.
Right? Very backward, very low base. And they have now coming to a point. Now is the hardest part.
Yes.
You see?
Discipline is
Hardest part. So
Yeah, it's to maintain, yeah.
I mean, I think they have to do, I think from your paper we have seen
Yes.
that how they cannot be sort of complacent anymore. I think at this point. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, both Anderson.